Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Pod for Israel. And we are in our next installment of the Case for Messiah. And today we'll be looking at Genesis 3:15. And so, Golan, the question that we're going to be dealing with today is the New Testament wrong about Genesis 3:15?
Does the New Testament refer to Genesis 15?
Well, it
Genesis
does.
3:15?
It does. And so obviously we don't believe that the New Testament is wrong, right? But at the same time, we want to definitely address some of the arguments against the New Testament's interpretation.
Yeah.
And so according to the New Testament, Genesis 3:15 is messianic. Now, it's worth saying that Genesis 3:15 is not mentioned a whole lot in the New Testament. That's for sure.
And it's not quoted word by word, right?
No, it's not. But in Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, verse 5, verse 9, you have this imagery of a woman about to give birth. She's crying out in labor pains. There's a dragon who's identified as the serpent of old who tries to kill the child, and the child is born, and he becomes the one that rules over the nations, and he crushes their heads with an iron scepter. And so
there's an allusion.
Yeah, so there's no question, though, that Genesis 3:15 here is being alluded to, and the New Testament does see in Genesis 3:15 a messianic prophecy or a passage that points to the Messiah.
Okay, so what are the main objections against this messianic interpretation of Genesis 3:15?
Well, actually, there are some really strong objections, and as we're going to see, they're pretty good objections, right? And so we want to take them very seriously, and we want to deal with them. And so we've come up with, as we've done our research, there are three primary objections.
Yeah.
Number one, Genesis 3:15 has nothing to do with the story of redemption, nothing to do with the Messiah. It's only about people and snakes. Seed of the serpent, seed is always a physical seed, and therefore we're dealing with snakes.
Okay, so the claim is saying that seed is only a physical seed, and that therefore there's physical snakes, physical people.
Yeah.
That's it.
So the battle is between the seed of the woman, people, and snakes, right?
Okay.
Baby snakes. Not baby sharks, right? There's a song there.
And the other objection, the second objection?
Genesis 3:15 has nothing to do with the virgin birth. Some claim that, the women don't have seed, and so, there's the seed of the woman, and therefore this has to be the virgin birth.
And the last one?
Okay, the last one is kind of what I would say is it's kind of an objection that's kind of an across-the-board objection to a lot of the messianic prophecies being fulfilled in Jesus, and that is, if Genesis 3:15 is about the Messiah, I'll give that to you. Jesus obviously didn't fulfill it because the devil is alive and well today. Yeah. He's still quite active, and therefore he did not crush the head of the serpent.
Okay, so let's start with claim number one, that Genesis talks only about people and snakes.
Okay, so let's look at it, and again, we talked about this last time. We really think it's important to not to present straw men, not to mischaracterize what the opposition is saying and then tear them down. Yeah. We want to actually really represent fairly what the opposition is saying about the opposing views, and then interact with it. So the first objection, right, that this is only about people and snakes. So you've got this Christian assumption, right? The Christian assumption of Genesis 3:15 is that there's a winner and there's a loser. Yeah. Genesis 3:15, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel.
Yeah, and so this is God talking to the snake, right?
Yeah, but the serpent.
Serpent.
So typically the argument goes, in order to understand this as a messianic passage, you ask a Christian, who has the worst blow? Who has the, and so of course hitting somebody on the head is much worse than striking somebody on the heel. And so therefore this is a prophecy that the Messiah would defeat Satan, okay? But Rashi's interpretation, 9 words in Hebrew, brilliant, honestly brilliant, so brilliant that John Calvin actually changed his position, and he argued and he agreed with Rashi that this is about people and snakes.
So what does Rashi say?
What does he say? And thou shalt bruise his heel, And you will have no height, i.e. the serpent. He'll be short or long, right? Not stand erect. You will be able to bite him only on the heel, but even at that spot you will kill him. Now let me kind of explain this because it's quite sophisticated. It's a brilliant response. And basically what Rashi is saying is that you have the same word for striking on the head and the same word for striking on the heel. But if you want to, you grew up in a kibbutz. If you saw a snake, how would you have to kill it?
With my leg, with my heel.
But you'd have to hit it on the head.
On the head.
Right?
Yeah.
That's the only way you can kill a snake is it. But if that same snake wants to kill you...
He would have to bite me
on the heel.
Yep.
But how does a snake can't hit you on the head?
Right.
Unless it's an anaconda from the Amazon, right? And so Genesis 49:17 says this, Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a horned snake in the path, that bites the horse's heel so that the rider falls backwards. And so what Rashi is saying is there's no winners here. Everybody's losers. So this can't be any kind of a promise of redemption. This is just about the conflict between people and snakes.
Yeah, and it's about reality. This is the facts of life. There's an enmity between man and snakes, and everybody can relate to it, right?
Correct. Exactly. Also, as we kind of explain the opposing position, they would also say that seed in the Hebrew Bible always refers to physical offspring, only and always to physical offspring.
So
and therefore,
seed is nothing spiritual. Seed is always a physical seed.
Correct. So if you have the seed of the woman, you're dealing with physical offspring of the woman. If you have seed of the serpent, you're dealing with the physical offspring of the serpent.
So people and snakes.
People and snakes, that's it. There's no winners, there's no losers, and we're not dealing with any spiritual realities. We're just dealing with physical realities.
And by the way, you mentioned, me growing up in the kibbutz. I think also this is what we learned in school, that this verse talks about the facts of life.
Correct.
People hate snakes, snakes hate people,
Correct.
and that's it.
Correct. So the seed of the serpent here are physical offspring of the serpent, seed of the woman, physical offspring of the woman. So the bottom line is etiology, not eschatology.
Yeah.
Remind me again, what is etiology?
So etiology just explains it sees reality, and the Bible explains why are things so, right?
Okay.
Why are the reality looks like it, like why there's the enmity between people and snakes, and this is the reason.
So the story of the Garden of Eden is just simply to explain why, number one, snakes kill people,
exactly.
people kill snakes, why women have pain in childbirth, it's a natural phenomenon, why men struggle against the elements, thorns, thistles, and why they die. That's it. There's nothing spiritual here.
Exactly.
Okay.
Especially not eschatological.
Correct. So, and let's admit this, Golan, this at first glance, this looks like a great explanation of the passage.
And I grew up in Israel learning this. This is
Right.
basics. This is just this is the reality. There's nothing more.
So let's respond. Okay.
So what about that seed?
Okay. So we've got a number of responses here. And again, we want to just challenge the viewers to study for themselves, right? We want them to study for themselves. So the first response is that we acknowledge that seed is physical. However, it's also used metaphorically in the
scriptures. So the Bible uses the word seed, zera, in Hebrew, also in a metaphorical way. And we have a few examples.
Yes. So we've got 3 examples here. So for instance, in Malachi 2:15.
And you're reading from which version?
We're actually using the Chabad version.
Which is an ultra-Orthodox?
It's an Orthodox translation, I'm assuming, but it's from their website. But notice how they translate Malachi 2:15. Now did he not make one who had the rest of the spirits? Now what does the one seek of the seed of God? Okay? The word here is zera Elohim.
Yep.
The seed of God. Now, the other English translations,
some put it the seed,
the godly
from
seed,
God,
but literally this is the seed of
Zera
God.
Elohim.
And obviously we wouldn't say that God has
of course not
a seed in that sense, right?
Yeah, so it's a metaphorical.
Correct.
And in Isaiah
57 verse 4, on whom will you enjoy yourselves? Against whom do you open your mouth wide? Against whom do you stick out your tongue? Are you not children of transgression, seed of falsehood?
So Isaiah is calling Israel seed of falsehood, and of course this is not a physical seed.
Right.
This is the spiritual meaning. This is the metaphorical meaning.
And obviously, when we say that God's calling Israel children of transgression or seed of falsehood, we're talking about in this particular context,
Exactly.
right? There's no intention here to accuse our people of anything.
Of course,
right?
Of course not.
But the point is that seed here is metaphorical. It's got to be.
And
right?
the last example?
The last one's an interesting example. It's from the verb to sow, but in Hebrew,
it's zorea.
So he who sows iniquity. And obviously you can't literally sow iniquity.
It doesn't have seeds, right?
It doesn't. Iniquity is not a seed.
Yeah.
Okay?
So that's another metaphor.
So seed is used metaphorically. So the second response.
So the seed of the serpent. What about the seed of the serpent?
So what we would argue in the context of Genesis 3:15 is that the seed of the serpent refers to spiritual enemies in the book of Genesis, not to physical snakes.
And we can actually show it from the text.
Correct. Exactly. In other words, here we're going to see that the best commentary in Scripture is Scripture.
So this is where it gets interesting.
Correct. So what I find amazing is that Genesis 4, the very next chapter is, we could say, an exposition of the meaning of Genesis 3. Mm-hmm. And in that passage, we have this deadly struggle between between two offspring, Cain and Abel.
Two brothers,
okay, from the same mother, but obviously their behavior is not the same.
It's as if they're from different seeds.
Yes. And now, just for time's sake, we're not going to compare all these things. You know, there are a lot of parallels between the story of Cain and Abel and the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. Yep. But just a couple of things. What's really interesting is that after God confronts Abel, when God confronts Cain, he says, "Where is your brother Abel?" Okay, what have you done? Which is interesting because that's exactly in chapter 3 what God says. Where are you? He says
same use of language
to Adam, and then what have you done?
Exactly.
But, and here's what's really important. I want you to notice the way that God speaks to Cain now. He basically uses the exact same language that he used to refer to the serpent.
Yep.
So Genesis 4:11. Now you are cursed from the ground.
Arur, yeah.
Arur min.
Arur min. Arur from, yeah.
And then exactly he says that in 3:14 of Genesis. Cursed are you more. Okay? Again, in the context, Cain rose up, kills Abel. And then Cain is worried whoever finds me is going to kill me. And so here we have the language, at least in terms of themes, of a deadly struggle between seed of serpent, seed of woman.
Exactly.
Okay, again, the fact that Cain goes out east of Eden, God drives Adam and Eve out east of Eden. So what we're arguing here is that the language that God uses of the serpent and applies it to Cain suggests that the serpent is Cain's spiritual, metaphorical father.
And it shows that the serpent is not just another snake.
Correct.
There's something else with this serpent, and the relationship between the serpent and Cain is different. It's spiritual.
So Cain, again, Genesis 4 is an exposition of Genesis 3. Now, Golan, you are our go-to for the sages. What did the Jewish sages what did they say about Cain?
So we see that even the sages see that there's something more, not only with Cain as a result of sin and something really evil, but the serpent himself. It's not just a regular serpent. And if you can read from the Babylon Talmud, Tractate Sotah 9b, and we're going to build the case.
Okay, so let's look at this. So it says, and so too we found with regard to the primeval snake who seduced Eve, for he placed his eyes on that which was unfit for him, and he wanted to
marry Eve. So he saw Adam and Eve naked, and he wanted Eve. So from the beginning, we see that the sages realize it's not a regular snake, because usually snakes are not attracted to women, right?
I don't think so.
Exactly.
Okay.
So Shabbat
146a, the snake came upon Eve.
So the snake came in a sexual way, of course.
So that's what the Hebrew says here. That's what it means, okay? When it seduced her to eat from the tree of the knowledge, it infected her with moral contamination. And this contamination remained in all human beings. When the Jewish people stood at Mount Sinai, their contamination ceased, whereas Gentiles did not stand at Mount Sinai, and their contamination never ceased.
So in this sense, the Jewish people are descendants of Seth, and the Gentiles are descendants of Cain. You see?
Interesting.
But it goes on, and this is the...
I think this is the clearest one in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, okay? So notice Samael. Who's Samael?
Samael is another name for Satan.
Okay, Samael riding on the serpent came to her.
To Eve.
Came to her.
Yeah.
And she conceived...
Cain. So she conceived, according to this rabbinic midrash, Eve conceived Cain from Satan.
Interesting. So in other words, what we're saying is that according to the context, Cain is presented as the metaphorical seed of the serpent.
Exactly.
Right?
Of course,
And
we don't think the rabbis actually thinks that Eve slept with the serpent, but spiritually speaking, that's what they're saying.
Correct. Okay. Now let's keep going. And we'll notice that the same kinds of things are also going on with Canaan.
Because it goes on. It's not bound to Cain and Abel.
The story continues.
Exactly.
The lines continue.
With a fight between two seeds, two spiritual seeds.
So Cain, and who's Cain's spiritual daddy? And so again, just for time's sake, it is really interesting that if you kind of start to compare the story of Noah with the story of Adam and Eve, Noah gets this renewed creation mandate, just like Adam. But what's interesting is that in Genesis 9:20, Noah plants a vineyard just like God had planted a garden. He drinks and takes of the fruit of the vine. Adam and Eve take of the fruit of the tree.
Yeah. And in Hebrew, it's obvious that the language is the same language.
Correct.
Yeah.
Noah uncovers himself. Adam and Eve are naked, right? Shem and Japheth cover up the nakedness of their father. God covers up the nakedness of Adam. And so it's clear that these are parallel texts.
Like Noah is the new Adam. It's like a new creation.
So the moment we start to see this, suddenly we realize that just like Genesis 4 is an interpretation of Genesis 3, we start to realize that the story of Adam or the story of Noah actually gives us insight into the meaning of Genesis 3:15. And sure enough, I want you to notice this. Genesis 9:25 through 27. So he said, right, to Canaan, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants."
And this is Noah speaking, right?
This is Noah.
Yep.
And then it says, "And let Canaan be his servant, and let Canaan be his servant." Well, that is absolutely a clear reference back to what God says to the serpent when he says, "Cursed are you." And then he puts him in the place of total humiliation. "On your belly you will go, and dust you will eat all the days of your life. There will be enmity between your seed and her seed." And so Canaan is presented
as the offspring,
as the
spiritual
offspring of the serpent. And so obviously Genesis 3:15 is not just dealing with people and snakes, but the redemptive story.
Yep, exactly.
Response 3. So not only does the serpent have a metaphorical seed, okay? But we also see that the seed of the woman refers, in the context of Genesis, not to every human being.
This is like a promised seed.
But a promised seed, a chosen line. And we have several passages that confirm this. So for instance, I think, again, Genesis 4, if we look at what it says in Genesis 4:25, Adam had relations with his, and we translated here woman because in Hebrew, wife and woman are the same. Woman again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Shet, Seth, for she said, God has placed for me another seed. Well, guess what? There are 3 words here, right? Isha, woman, seed, and to put or to place.
Ashit or Shet,
that only appear one other time in the entire Hebrew Bible. Genesis 3:15.
So it's clear, identical language.
So God says, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed." So Eve is actually interpreting Genesis 3:15 here, not as every human being, but as a specific seed, a specific line, a special line, a chosen line. By the way, the same thing happens in Genesis 5:29 when we're dealing with the sons of Seth, or the sons of Adam on the chosen side of the line. We come to Noah, and it's interesting how his father names Noah. Now, he called his name Noah, saying, "This one will give us rest from our pain from our work and from the pain of our hands arising from the ground, which the Lord has cursed.
And pain is etzev, yitzabon.
Itzavon. And so here we
Grieve.
have an absolute reference back to Genesis 3, but what's remarkable is that we have the hope of someone within the chosen line who will bring relief from the curse. And so the seed of the woman here cannot be every human being. We're dealing with the story of redemption through a chosen line.
And it goes, and there's two seeds fighting among themselves with two lines.
A deadly struggle. And so we even, once again, let's go back now to Noah's words when he wakes up from his stupor, right? And he realizes what happens.
Yep.
Okay. He says, cursed be Cain, a servant of servants, right? A parallel to the serpent and to the seed of the serpent. But then he says, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. And so here we see that the Shem is associated, just like Seth, just like Noah, with the seed of the woman. So once again, we see that the whole attempt to say this is just about people and snakes, it doesn't fit the larger context.
And it seems that the seed is like a really central motif all over Genesis.
The word seed, I forget how many times I counted before this podcast, but we've actually listed all these references. Seed is crucial. Like the word seed is not just, it's a major motif in Genesis.
And it's placed in strategic places, right? And
promises to the seed. And you've got, what's interesting is you've got, Genesis is divided up into 10 what's called toldot structures, like the generation structures. And the whole purpose is to identify chosen and not so chosen or unchosen
again,
seed.
the two lines, the two seeds. Yeah.
And another major theme in Genesis is enmity between two bloodlines, right? Different bloodlines where you've got the blessing coming through a particular bloodline. So Genesis 3:15, just about people and snakes, it doesn't fit the story.
It's almost like an exposition to the whole story of Genesis.
It's the teaser. It's the opening, just like a great movie, right? You've got the beginning, the introduction to the movie, sets your expectations for the rest of the movie.
So the fourth response is that the seed in Genesis is not only a chosen line, but also a promised king.
Okay. It's really important to see that, yes, there's a chosen line. And in seed, there's actually a collective aspect to seed, because seed can mean children, descendants, but seed can also mean a single descendant. And what's interesting is if you trace the theme of Genesis, you'll realize that ultimately out of the chosen line will come a chosen king.
A king.
Again, for time's sake, we're not going to have time to deal with all of the passages, but I just want you to notice the phrase, the last days.
Acharit hayamim in Hebrew.
Ba'achrit yamim. It actually appears four times in the Torah, but I want to call attention to three of them. In three places in the Torah, you have a focus on an individual who is blessing the tribes of Israel. Jacob, Balaam, who tries to curse but blesses them, and Moses, right at the end of the Torah.
By the way, there's a rabbinic commentator that says that every time in the Torah that Acharit HaYamim appears, it's a messianic prophecy.
Kimchi actually says every time the phrase appears, it's about the Messiah, also in the prophets. Okay? But notice that Jacob says in Genesis 49:1, I will tell you what will happen to you in the last days.
Acharit HaYamim.
Balaam says in Numbers 24:14, I will tell you what this people do to your people in the last days. Deuteronomy 21 verse 29, evil will befall you in the last days. And so eschatology is central to these poems about blessing in the Torah. And what's interesting is that in the context of Jacob talking about the last days, he suddenly talks about Judah and that your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. You've taken control of his head, the enemies, and the scepter will not depart from Judah, and he will rule over the nations. Again, what's interesting, if you look then at Balaam's prophecy, and you've got in the last days this star, he sees a star who will come forth, a scepter out of Jacob, and he will crush through the foreheads of Moab.
There's a language.
Deuteronomy 33 and verse 5 and then verse 7, a reference to a king. Our point here, Golan, is that if we take seriously Genesis 3:15 in the context not just of Genesis, but in the context of the whole Torah, it is clear that this chosen line will bring forth a chosen king. And so ultimately, this king is the one who will crush the heads of the enemies.
So we're talking about a special seed,
This
not
is-
every human being. Yeah.
This is messianic.
Yep. And response number 5, even other books in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh, interpret Genesis 3:15
Right.
in an eschatological way.
So we say, Im kol hakavod l'Rashi, with all
With
due
all due
respect
respect.
to Rashi, right? If I have to choose between an interpretation of a later rabbi or the interpretation that the Hebrew Bible gives of passages,
It's always better to go with the earliest.
always better. It's always best. It is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And what we see, just a couple of
because
examples.
of the common language, right?
Yes. So a couple of things. So again, in Genesis 3:15, you've got this reference to enmity and seed and striking on the head.
Yep.
What's interesting is the word enmity, the root, appears elsewhere only 2 other times in Genesis. And in both cases, there's a promise of a seed who will possess the gate of his enemies.
Yeah, and in
right?
Hebrew, you see it's almost similar.
so clear. But so in Genesis 22, verse 17, you've got this seed, possessing the gate of enemies. And then you have in Numbers 24, 17 through 18, which is a messianic passage, you actually have a midrash or an interpretation of Genesis 22, 17 that's messianic.
Yep.
He talks about this king that's going to crush through the forehead of Moab. But notice it says, and tear down all the sons of Sheth. Edom shall be a possession, right? Seir, its enemies,
Seir
also
oivav.
will be a possession.
Yep.
Now the word here, Seir, its enemies,
In Hebrew, it looks almost
exactly
the same,
as
or
the
exactly.
gates of his enemies.
Exactly.
And the phrase here is so unique that what we see is a messianic interpretation, not just of God's promise to Abraham, but a messianic interpretation of Genesis 3:15.
An early midrash. Huh?
Correct. You've got a messianic interpretation of Genesis 3:14 and 15 in the book
In
of
Isaiah.
Isaiah. And so, again, this whole reference to a serpent eating dust, okay? At the end of Isaiah 65, verse 23, you've got reference to a blessed seed. But notice what it says in verse 25.
Yep.
The wolf and the lamb will graze together, and the lion will eat straw like an ox, and dust will be the serpent's food. Now, even the ancient rabbis, and ancient interpreters, Jewish interpreters, they see this as a reference to Genesis 3:14. In other words, Isaiah is reading the story of Genesis 3:14 and 15.
He's prophesying
It's
through
not
the
just-
lens of Genesis.
It's not just about people and snakes. It's about God's messianic program.
Yep. And the battle between the seeds go on, between the two spiritual seeds.
Correct. Again, in Psalm 72, verses 8 and 9, and then verse 17, again, you've got this king that's going to rule from sea to sea to the ends of the earth, and his enemies will what? Lick the dust.
Exactly, like the snake, like the
And
serpent.
again, the reference to the fact that this king in Psalm 72 is going to rule from sea to sea to the ends of the earth, because that's the exact same language we find in Zechariah 9 and 10 about the Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
Our point being that Genesis 3:15 is being interpreted as eschatology by the prophets and ultimately fulfilled in the Messiah.
And also in Psalm 110, right?
So here's another interesting
Another
one.
with Hebrew again, the play of
So,
words.
so the word eva, a sheet, I will put enmity. It's a cluster of words, or it's a word pair that's only found one other time in the entire Hebrew Bible. And guess where it's found? It's found in Psalm 110, verse 1, where God says, a Psalm of David, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. The word, I will make your enemies, it's the only time elsewhere in the entire Hebrew Bible where you have that two pairs of words put together. And then in verse 6, it says that this king will shatter the head, crush the head. And so once again, Genesis 3:15.
David is doing a midrash.
David is reading Genesis 3:15 just like the New Testament, but long before the New Testament.
So what about response 6? Other Jewish sources beside the Hebrew Bible in the New Testament that interpret Genesis 3:15?
So my dear hatted friend, the beautiful hat, you're going to tell us, right? What did you find in terms of rabbinic exegesis?
Okay, so the first example
Genesis?
is what we call Tirgum Yerushalmi or Neophiti to Aramaic, and there it specifically just interpreting, translating Genesis 3:15 into Aramaic, specifically says in the day of the King Messiah.
Just a little correction. So the Jerusalem Aramaic Targum and the Nephidi, they're actually two different Targums, but they're very similar.
Exactly, they're
very
really
similar. And both of these Targums, which are quite ancient, interpret this passage messianically.
And by the way, also in Targum Yonatan, it says it ends with the King Messiah, exactly like the Nephidi.
So the New Testament is not being
Not
unique,
alone.
right? Okay. What about Toldot Yitzchak?
Yeah, so Toldot Yitzchak, it's maybe a later commentary, but still a rabbinic commentary, a valid one. And what does it say there?
Okay, we should read this. And he said, all the days of your life, Genesis 3:14, to include the time of the Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
And even then, when the enmity between the serpent and the seed of the woman has been removed, as it is written, the nursing child will play by the hole of the cobra, Isaiah 11.
Yep.
The food of dust will never depart from him, as it is written, and dust will be the serpent's food. Here it is, Isaiah 65. And thus the sages said at the departure from Egypt, the days of your life, this world, all the days of your life, to bring in the days of the Messiah. And so we're not saying anything by saying that Genesis 3:15 is messianic. We're not.
This is nothing new under the sun, right?
And the New Testament is written by Jewish people who are reading the Bible in a very Jewish manner, and so they're
like
not
other Jewish people.
Exactly.
Yeah? Yep.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's go to claim number 2, that Genesis 3:15 has nothing to do with the virgin birth.
Okay, so let's look at
What
the
about
argument.
that?
Well, let's look at the argument. So the common Christian assumption
Is?
says those who would try to refute the messianic or the Christian interpretation.
Women do not have seed or sperm, and that's why.
If the fact that there's the seed of the women don't have seed, therefore this has to be a virgin, right? And so that's kind of the Christian assumption,
Yep.
okay? But
those who reject this assumption are saying what?
well, that seed doesn't here refer to sperm; it refers to offspring, whether singular or collective.
Yeah, and not only that, there's other passages.
There are 3 other passages in the Torah that refer to the seed of women.
Specifically speak about the seed of women. So Eve wasn't the only one.
Right. And so this is the way to say refute the interpretation that says that this is about the virgin birth.
So what is our response?
Well, here's our response, Golan.
First of all, we agree. Right?
We agree, right? I mean, I think to say that this passage is referring to the virgin birth is not a reflection on the New Testament's handling of the text.
Yeah.
I think it's a reflection of bad Christian interpretation.
So in other words,
passage.
The New Testament doesn't use Genesis 3:15 to prove the virgin birth,
No,
right?
the New Testament never makes that claim. And interesting, let's just kind of look at it. So, Eve actually says that God gives her a seed in place of Abel.
In 4:25,
so she
right?
has a seed,
Yep.
a child, a son. Hagar, she has a seed. I will greatly multiply your seed. Rebecca has a
Also.
seed, and may your seed possess the gate of those who hate him. And so here, I would argue that the refutation is not a refutation against the New Testament's interpretation, and not our interpretation.
Misinterpretation.
It's just a refutation of an interpretation that
Exactly.
needs to be refuted.
Exactly.
Because we disagree with that interpretation too.
Exactly.
Okay, but there's a but.
And this is interesting.
There is a but. Okay, I think more does need to be said about Genesis 3, and particularly the role of the woman in verse 16, verses 15 and 16.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and we talked about this, that you've got this reference to the woman and the struggle of the woman and the seed of the woman. Here's what's really interesting is that we see that women are part of the story of redemption, right, in Genesis.
And this promised seed is going to come with etzev, with suffering.
With suffering, but not only suffering, but supernatural.
So God would intervene.
There are all sorts of obstacles that God overcomes, all sorts of supernatural things he does so that the matriarchs can become pregnant, okay? So for instance...
So we have a few examples, yeah?
Sarai, Rebecca, Rachel, all of them were barren. Okay, Genesis 11:30, Genesis 25:21, Genesis 29:31.
Yeah, and there's a Hebrew scholar who says that even Leah was barren because it says God opened her womb. So even an Israeli scholar.
So every single pregnancy in the story of God bringing forth the chosen line is miraculous.
Even Ruth, which is the grandma or grandma of the Messiah, of David.
So how was that miraculous?
Because in Ruth it says, he opened her womb after she was married for 10 years to Machlon. Ruth was married for 10 years, never had kids. She marries Boaz, boom, there's
That's
a kid.
An amazing point.
That's why this Israeli scholar said that it's not only Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel, it's Leah and Ruth and other key women in the Bible.
So we would expect in the story of redemption to be consistent with what God does in Genesis, miraculous pregnancies, right?
Exactly. So the promised seed would come with a miraculous pregnancy.
And so while we would agree that Genesis 3:15 does not refer to the virgin birth, we think that that's just an incorrect handling of the passage. The fact of the matter is the reference to the woman in Genesis 3 and the ways in which God uses the chosen matriarchs and the way that they become pregnant, it would not be inconsistent, or in fact, it would be quite expected that the Messiah's mother would also experience a supernatural pregnancy.
It gives us an expectation for the Messiah's birth.
Yes,
it would also be a supernatural.
It's not a surprise.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the last claim.
Yes.
Okay, so you convinced me. Genesis 3:15 is talking about the Messiah. But the devil is still around. What's going on with that?
Tell me about
Wasn't
it.
The Messiah supposed to crush his head?
Yeah, tell me about it. Yeah, the devil is still very active, right? And so one of the arguments, the opposing arguments, is that, even in the New Testament, Satan is alive and well. And so...
Yeah, the New Testament affirms that.
In Acts chapter 5, verse 3, I want to look at actually 1 Peter 5:8. Be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour.
So the New Testament doesn't deny that the devil is still around, kicking.
Okay, but the refutation or the opposition would say, so this is proof that Jesus didn't fulfill Genesis 3:15. So even if it's about the Messiah, it can't be about Jesus.
Yep.
Okay? So our response, it would be, again, let's get things clear, okay? The New Testament never claims that the devil's head was crushed at the cross.
At the first coming of Yeshua. Yeah.
Correct. In other words, it never makes that claim. Now, again, I've heard Christians make that claim. I've heard Christians make that claim that the devil was completely defeated and it was done, but the New Testament doesn't make that claim. Right. Genesis 3:15, and the point of Genesis 3:15 is that there would be a deadly struggle between the serpent seed and the woman's seed. Genesis makes clear that in spite of the struggle, the seed of the woman would one day be victorious.
Exactly.
Okay, Genesis 22:17, your seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. It says of Judah in Genesis 49, verse 8, Judah, your brother shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Again, taking control of the head of the enemies. Isaiah affirms that when the Messiah reigns, the serpent will eat dust.
So in the end of days,
yes,
it would happen.
So according to the New Testament, the devil's judgment or the final judgment of the devil is in the future. Now, was there some kind of a defeat or of a humiliation of the devil on the cross? Of course there was. We don't deny that either, and the New Testament talks about that. But the New Testament never claims that the devil is completely crushed and defeated at the first coming of Jesus. Rather,
and we're going back to Revelation. We started with Revelation and we're ending
Revelation
with it.
20 verses 7 through 10. Notice what the New Testament says. When the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. The number of them is like the sand of the seashore, and they came up on the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints in the beloved city. And fire came down from heaven and devoured them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever.
In other words, when Yeshua's return, when he returns the second time, then the devil would be defeated.
So let's make things really clear, because I guess what typically happens is the opposition uses the fact that the kingdom wasn't set up, the fact that, for instance, the devil is still alive and well, as sort of proof that Jesus isn't the Messiah. No, this is just basically showing that the rabbinic Jewish expectation of the Messiah is at odds with the New Testament understanding of what the Messiah is supposed to do. And that's you can't use that as an argument against. In other words, you have to prove that in the Hebrew Bible, there is no reference to the rejection of the Messiah, to the suffering of the Messiah. And so the bottom line is this objection doesn't hold any weight. All it simply does is it reinforces what the rabbis believe to be the correct picture about the Messiah. But here's where we would differ. And we would argue that the New Testament reading of Genesis 3:15, the New Testament interpretation of Genesis 3:15 is very solid, very substantial, and therefore there are very good reasons to believe that Jesus is the promised Messiah.
So let's do a short summary and just sum up the three arguments that we made.
So summarize.
Yep.
Although some claim that Genesis 3:15 is just about people and snakes, if we look at the verse in the immediate and larger context,
Close reading of the text, right?
Close reading of the text, it's clear it refers to God's promise to bring blessing through a chosen seed.
And we see it all through Genesis, let alone the entire Bible, of course. Yeah?
Correct. Although Genesis 3:15 does not refer to the virgin birth, the story of Genesis tells us it helps us to expect miraculous pregnancies of our matriarchs as God fulfills Genesis 3:15.
So the promised seed does come with a pain and with an intervention of the Lord.
Somehow God overcomes something, a barrier. And then third and finally, yes, the devil is still active, but that doesn't refute the New Testament's interpretation of this passage.
The New Testament says...
Exactly. On the contrary, it just reinforces it that the New Testament tells us that his defeat is sometime in the future. And so once again, we turn to you, our viewers, and we want to encourage you to study these passages, to seek and to see if, in fact, the New Testament has accurately understood the Hebrew Bible and its promise of the coming Messiah, and that Jesus is that promised Messiah.
Amen.
Golan, enjoyed speaking to you yet again.
Thanks, old buddy.
If this touched your heart, will you help pay it forward to reach others who need to hear this message? Partner with our team to bring the gospel to Israel and the nations.